I'm Andy Mills, and you're listening to Reflector.
Stealing, putty mama, don't you tell on me.
Someone has stolen the vote. They're not really the president. They was appointed.
I think the election was stolen from the people of Georgia.
I'll tell you what, they're trying to rig this election.
Don't you tell on me. I'm stealing back to my same old used to be.
For today, our second installment in our look back on the history of claims that an election was stolen, to see what it says about American politics right now and where we might be headed next.
Chapter 3. The Hackers of 2004.
Okay, so before talking to you, I don't think I ever considered 2004 to be among the U.S. presidential elections that had claims of theft and fraud. Can you tell me what happens in 2004? Why does it make the list?
So first of all, you already have a public that has become polarized first by Bush v. Gore.
Bush wants stop the count. Bush wants every vote.
I think that the Bushes are intentionally trying to rig this election.
And then by Iraq.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth.
The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder.
What evidence did this administration have to justify war?
And those two things happening so close together ramped up the anger level between left and right. And then you go into 2004, and you have George W. Bush, who is a known quantity. He's the guy who got us into Iraq and all the rest of it. And then John Kerry, who, to me, I always thought he was funnily like a Democrat's attempt to pick a Republican candidate.
For John Kerry, a stronger America begins at home. Real plans to create jobs here, not overseas. Lower healthcare costs, independence from Middle East oil, and in the world, a strong military and strong alliances to defeat terror.
I defended this country as a young man, and I will defend it as president.
Megan says that John Kerry's campaign focused a lot on keeping American companies from sending jobs overseas, and it highlighted the fact that Kerry was a decorated Vietnam War veteran, while at the same time signaling to other voters who shared his stance on the Iraq War that he had also been an outspoken advocate against the Vietnam War.
And so he was simultaneously trying to run on his warrior cred with Republicans and his anti-war cred with Democrats.
Would you say that the contest is starkly different than even just in 2000 between Bush and Gore?
Yes.
Now that it's Bush and Kerry?
It's more partisan, more angry.
We live in the time where we have fictitious election results that elects a fictitious president. We live in a time where we have a man sending us to war for fictitious reasons.
Much more polarized.
John Kerry says he's author of a strategy to win the war on terror against the Japanese Yakuza. Never mentions Al-Qaeda. Says nothing about Osama bin Laden. Calls Yasser Arafat a statesman. And Kerry's focus? Global crime, not terrorism. How can John Kerry win a war if he doesn't know the enemy?
This is where you start hearing for the first time the very familiar rhetoric that this is the most important election of our lives.
The election of 2004 is one of the most important, not just in our lives, but in our history.
Fellow Americans, this is the most important election of our lifetime.
We've come a long way from 1960. We've even come a long way from 2000.
Yeah, I would argue that. I mean, certainly it had been ramping up in the 90s, but the tone really changed. In part because I do think that the left, and even though I disagree with them, I understand why the left feels that they were cheated out of the election by the Supreme Court, but also because that accident of history with this tiny 537 vote margin gets everyone fixated on it and arguing about it. And no one can believe that the other side's arguing in any kind of good faith. And it just seems like not just like we're running a race and we disagree about a bunch of policy stuff, but the other team is trying to steal this election from me.
That idea was out there.
Yeah, because of Bush v. Gore, because of Iraq, because of 9/11. People are just much more emotionally invested in politics than they had been in the 90s.
From ABC election headquarters in New York, this is the 2004 vote.
And so you're going into the 2004 election with that.
In the West, take a look at the map because that's what it is all about tonight, and it has caused the most enormous case of nerves in the Bush and Kerry campaigns.
As election night unfolded, the news networks were open about the fact that they were committed to being far more cautious than they had been in 2000. And they talked openly about avoiding another night where they made projections about a state too soon.
How are we preventing 4 years ago?
Well, we've learned a lot of lessons, Larry, from what happened 4 years ago. The data, the new research that's coming in. This is a much more sophisticated operation. But I think it all boils down to, when all is said and done, is this. We're much more cautious this time than we were 4 years ago. And if we don't know something, we'll tell our viewers we simply don't know.
And then the exit polls happen.
So let's take a look at our exit poll results.
And we're going to be sharing these exit poll numbers with our viewers around the world all throughout the night.
And remind me, what is an exit poll and why does it mean anything?
You literally just stand outside a polling place and buttonhole people as they leave and say,
who'd you vote for?
Who did you vote for?
They have been looking at numbers coming in all day long, Wolf, the so-called exit polls. These are interviews with voters as they left the polling places about.
And they seem to show that Kerry's winning.
Wow.
We're very proud of John Kerry. Sort of the ripple around.
In fact, the exit polls looked so good for Kerry that Democrats like Teddy Kennedy were already going on television and celebrating Kerry's victory.
And now, above all, we got John Kerry, hometown boy, that's won the presidency.
Let me just point out, Senator Kennedy, he hasn't won the presidency yet. It's still relatively early in this night.
Well, I think it is important that those that haven't voted go out and participate and vote.
But as the night wore on...
Good evening. It is 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time at this hour. The too close to call states still too close to call.
It became clear that this election was going to be really close.
The country remains apparently evenly divided, with the red and the blue states, by and large, as we showed, lining up pretty much the way they did 4 years ago.
And that actually, George W. Bush was overperforming his early exit polls.
As the evening opened, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, and people were looking at exit polls and the like. And among Republicans, there were some long faces of deep concern that the president seemed to be underperforming. But now as these actual numbers come in, they must feel we've got a really big fighting chance here.
3:25 a.m. on the East Coast. We're watching this election very, very closely. We don't know who's going to be the next president of the United States.
As state after state submitted their results, George W. Bush looked bound for re-election. Until, yet again, one state remained too close to call.
We are not yet ready to call Ohio. We have said it's too close to call, but we are taking a hard look at it. We're not just letting it sit
So
there.
the morning after Election Day, people again woke up to see that the race for president was coming down to just one state. And some were nervous that they were about to witness a rerun of the chaos from 2000. But by 1 p.m., Bush was declared the winner.
Thank you all for coming. We had a long night and a great night.
And unlike in Florida in 2000, where it came down to just a few hundred votes separating Bush from Gore, this time in Ohio, Bush's lead was well over 110,000 votes. And this time, he also won the popular vote.
Earlier today, Senator Kerry called with his congratulations. We had a really good phone call. He was very gracious. Senator Kerry waged a spirited campaign, and he and his supporters can be proud of their efforts.
It was a bitter disappointment for many Democrats because it seemed that yet again, victory was so close at hand. But for other Democrats, the distance between the early exit polls and the final voter outcome was evidence of something far more suspicious.
And people thought, oh, someone stole the election. And in fact, there was this documentary on HBO called Hacking Democracy.
This is the story of a small group of citizens headed by a grandmother from Seattle.
Though it is now no longer available on HBO's website, the documentary Hacking Democracy lays out exactly what these Americans were worried about.
They set out on a journey to ask one simple question. How does America count its votes?
And it is very much a product of its time.
What they found was secrecy, votes in the trash, and how to change the course of history.
Something broken in the promised land.
When people see what's really going on, there is no way we will allow this to continue.
So this documentary follows a group of Americans who are convinced that voting machines used in the 2004 election had been hacked to ensure that Bush beat Kerry.
To anyone who's familiar with the situation knows there's fraud in that election. The optical scan machines are being rigged to produce a result for Bush.
I'd say the thing that shocked me was how easy vote totals could be changed. So imagine you can go into a box and essentially rewrite history. And that's pretty scary to me.
The machines that they focused on were built by a company called Diebold, or sometimes pronounced Diebold, and were used in several states, including Ohio.
I put 3 words into a news search engine, voting machines and glitch, and found dozens and dozens of elections that were miscounted by the machines. And about that time, I thought, we really have a problem.
What Bev had found was that you couldn't necessarily rely on the election results produced by voting machines.
You know, I began looking into these voting machines, and one reason I was so curious is because it's a secret how they work. The companies that make them keep it a secret.
And part of the reason for their suspicion was grounded in the fact that the CEO of the company that manufactured these machines, a guy named Walden Odell, was an active supporter and donor to Republican causes and candidates, including George W. Bush.
In 2003, Walden Odell, the CEO of Diebold, had written a fundraising letter promising to deliver the votes of Ohio to George W. Bush.
There were many people who saw a clear conflict of interest here, and in the documentary, this group of activists tries to uncover evidence that the election had been stolen.
Ballots, secrecy envelopes.
They dug through dumpsters outside of voting precincts.
It's legal. When they put documents out in a dumpster in public areas, it's perfectly legal to go get them because they're no longer protecting them.
They went in groups to monitor ballot recounting in states like Ohio.
We've got about 2 more hours worth of work on hand-counted ballots.
And that's it?
And then we'll continue to run through the tabulation machine, and they're starting to inspect poll books, and everything's going very well.
Great, thank you. And I did manage to capture all the election officials saying everything's running smoothly, everything's going perfectly. So whenever they say that, you know, they've done something to make certain of that.
And eventually, they actually got a hold of one of these voting machines and attempted to see if it was at all possible to hack it and tamper with the results.
Placing the undercard in this device and telling it to turn off its counting function and do its reporting function will now cause the voting machine to print out a tape reading the number of votes that it had just.
And in fact, this documentary, they go and they find an expert to try to hack these machines, and they succeed.
Oh my.
Of course. Oh no. What is it? 7 yes, 1 no. Oh my God.
If I had not seen what was behind this, I would have certified this election as a true and accurate result of a vote.
Okay, so to understand what's happening here,
Oh my gosh, do you know what this means?
you need to know that many of the Diebold voting machines stored their votes on a small, removable memory card. And after the votes were cast, these memory cards were collected and then taken by an election official to another machine where the data was uploaded and tallied. In Hacking Democracy, an expert showed that it was possible to write malicious code and embed it into one of these memory cards before any vote had been cast. This code could theoretically switch votes from one candidate to another without detection. The documentary suggested that Diebold technicians or others with access could have potentially tampered with these memory cards, not just in Ohio, but across the country, and this would be a possible explanation for the discrepancies between the exit polls and the final vote count.
There are people out there who are giving their lives to try to make our elections secure, and they're being called conspiracy theorists and technophobes. How can this be happening to our elections?
All right, so the crew in the documentary, they prove that these machines were hackable.
Yeah.
And that if you really wanted to and you didn't get caught and everything went exactly as you planned, something nefarious like this could have happened. Is that right?
If everything turned out right, it could have happened. And the problem with that, first of all, just to do this physically, I mean, you're taking memory cards to all the Diebold machines and sticking the bad memory card in. No, okay, let's say that Diebold is in on it. You would still need to go out and service machines that maybe no one's called you to service. You would still have to get all of these techs to go in and stick the new memory card in to hack the machine. You would have to have no one pick it up on an audit. And because this had happened nationwide, because Kerry's votes didn't match the exit polls in lots of places.
Places that didn't have the Diebold machines.
Yes. So if it was just the Diebold machines, did they hack all the other machines too? You know, the number of people who would have had to have been involved in order to make Kerry lose was just improbably large, leaving aside the technical feasibility. You would need a conspiracy of tens of thousands of people.
Now, the work of these activists was not ignored. In fact, the documentary was nominated for an Emmy Award. And while they didn't sign on to all their claims, several prominent Democrats sought to give voice to some of these concerns.
I agree with tens of millions of Americans who are very worried that when they cast the ballot on an electronic voting machine, that there is no paper trail to record that vote.
And that included Bernie Sanders and Nancy Pelosi.
Constantly shifting vote tallies in Ohio and malfunctioning electronic machines, which may not have paper receipts, have led to additional loss of confidence by the public.
Eventually, there were extensive investigations into Diebold and the voting machines by the Government Accountability Office, which is an independent, nonpartisan agency. And on the one hand, their findings revealed that there were some counting irregularities, that the machines had vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed, and also that some Diebold employees had made donations to the Republican Party, which is legal, but is something that erodes public trust. But on the other hand, in the end, they found no evidence of hacking or vote manipulation, and the judge ruled that these machines did not impact the result of the election.
Now, obviously, it is a problem if you can do this, and this is a problem that Diebold should fix. And they did.
Mm-hmm. The investigations and their findings put to rest most people's concerns that George W. Bush had stolen the election. And reporters and movie critics eventually spoke out against hacking democracy and some of its claims. However, some people, to this day, remain firm that these machines are what delivered Bush his second term in office.
Our democracy could go out of business. We won't have a republic left. It won't be recognizable if we don't get rid of the secrecy. And if we don't open this thing up again and quickly, we will never again see what's going on. We're going to have to go back in there and take this back by whatever means necessary.
I think what Democrats forget about this story, what it shows, is that there are always people out there who, if they lose an election, are willing to believe that it was stolen from them, are going to believe that it was stolen from them. And so this is something I did not appreciate until 2020. What really matters is that elites do not feed that, is that elites keep to the truce.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do this to us, we don't do this to you, because that is how peaceful transfer of power happens, and that is how we maintain, this is how we get to be in power, is that we make our followers respect the results of elections so that you will make your followers respect the results of an election. Democracy, in a very weird way, is an elite truce. And John Kerry did not break that truce. I mean, you could see on progressive websites, you could very commonly come across the Diebold conspiracy theory.
But the people in positions of power, whether they are in media or in democratic politics, they not only are putting it down, they're essentially memory holing it, saying like, never happened, never heard of it.
Yep. They just refuse to feed it.
Thank you so much. You just have no idea how warming and how generous that welcome is, your love is, your affection, and I'm gratified by it. Earlier today, I spoke to President Bush, and I offered him and Laura our congratulations on their victory. We had a good conversation, and we talked about the danger of division in our country and the desperate need for unity, for finding the common ground, coming together. Today, I hope that we can begin the healing.
After a short break, what happens when a candidate and the media do decide to break that truce? Stay with us.
Hello, this is Matt with Reflector, and this episode is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is one of the most helpful tools that I use every day to navigate the echo chambers and media bias plaguing our world. Here's an example of what I mean. Back in January, pro-Palestinian protesters gathered outside the White House to call for a ceasefire.
Tense moments at the White House overnight. Pro-Palestinian protesters broke through a temporary gate.
The protest eventually became violent, and some White House staff nearby were evacuated.
Washington, D.C.'s police chief says things were thrown at cops. Riot police were trying to stop the crowd.
Now, when I came across the story on the Ground News app, they had done this great service where I could swipe between the headlines to see how different media outlets described the same story. So I would see NPR's headline, Pro-Palestinian Demonstrators in D.C. March to Demand Ceasefire in Gaza. Next to The Messenger's headline, Pro-Palestinian Protesters Damage Fence Outside White House, Forcing Evacuation of Nearby Staff. Right next to The Blaze's headline, Palestinian supporters try to breach White House fencing, rioters attack officers, staffers relocated, no arrests. Ground News helps me not just learn about a single news item, but also see that news in the context of the larger media world. Now, whether you're on the political left or on the political right, or like a lot of people these days, you don't really know where you fit in, we can all agree that it's hard to trust what you see in the news, and on your phones, and in your social media feeds. Ground News cares about this problem, and they're working to help. On top of showing different headlines, they offer blind spot reports to show you stories outside your bubble. They collect local reporting on the city or the town that you live in, and they rate news stories and outlets on their level of bias. I really think that if you like this podcast, you would like their mission. To go check them out, use the link ground.news/reflector. That's ground.news/reflector, and you'll get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. We appreciate what they're up to. We appreciate their support of this podcast. So go check them out and make sure you use our link, ground.news/reflector, so they know that we sent you.
I love my life. I have a wonderful family. They're saying, Dad, you're going to do something that's going to be so tough. You know, all of my life I've heard that a truly successful person, a really, really successful person, cannot run for public office. And yet that's the kind of mindset that you need to make this country great again. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
Chapter 4. Not My President.
Okay, so let's get to everyone's favorite presidential election campaign. The campaign that in some ways has never died.
Live in our hearts forever.
2016.
That's right.
I don't think people need to be reminded that eventually this becomes a contest between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Thank you so very, very much. You brought our country back. Now it's time, your time, to secure the gains and move ahead. And you know what? America can't succeed unless you succeed. That is why I am running for President of the United States.
How do we even describe the ways in which the campaign of 2016 differed from 1960, from 2000, from 2004 even?
Well, there's a lot going on here, and one is that partisanship has ramped way up, even from 2004.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
At this point in American history, polarization has gotten to the point where more and more people don't just disagree with the other party, but increasingly see members of the other political party as immoral and dangerous. And the candidates, in many ways, embodied that spirit.
We know in our country the difference between leadership and dictatorship, right?
Crooked Hillary Clinton. Oh, she's crooked, folks. She's crooked as a $3 bill. And lock her up is right.
The two candidates were starkly different in everything from temperament to policy to background. Hillary Clinton was in many ways a poster child of establishment Democratic politics, with decades of experience as a politician and the usual donors and institutional support. While Donald Trump, unlike any previous U.S. president, had never held any public office or military position. He launched a self-funded campaign and ran not only against the Democratic policies of the Obama administration, but also against some of the core policies of the Republican Party, especially under George W. Bush.
Trump here really is unique.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right?
He has no connection to the party. He doesn't have obligations to people within the party because he's not a creature of the party.
The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
He was not selected by the party for being the kind of person who can work with the party, which basically every presidential candidate we've had in the modern era has been, right? They all had to come up through the system, which meant people like Trump couldn't get through it.
They lied. Okay. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
All right. Governor Bush, y'all ready for this?
And social media let him bypass that.
They're bringing crime. They're rapists. But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out. And some, I assume, are good people. But we're going to build a wall.
Donald Trump was uniquely good at going viral.
And I think you can see I'm having a good time. I really am.
And that became powerful in 2016 because fueling both the rise in partisanship across the country and Trump's ability to mount this unprecedented campaign was the fact that this was the first election to take place in the era of mass social media. In 2008, Obama had harnessed the power of the internet using email to organize and reach voters, then Facebook as its presence grew. But by 2016, social media had drastically changed, due in part to the implementation of algorithms that rewarded things like virality, outrage, and engagement.
Well, we have some of the dumbest leaders in the world. How stupid are our leaders. How stupid are these politicians to allow this to happen?
And so what we have is an elite who is uniquely, in American politics, unconstrained.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate just how different politics felt before 2014, 2015. Trump is a part of that, but there was something way bigger than Trump that was happening in the country, and in some ways was happening all over the world, that made this moment, this contest, so different that it really does feel like there's a line in the sand where there is before and there is after.
Right.
Eventually, as we all now know, the election was really, really close. And while he lost the popular vote, late on election night, shocking many.
Sorry to keep you waiting. Complicated business. Complicated.
Donald Trump won.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton. She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory. And I congratulated her and her family on a very, very hard fight.
And even though he had attacked Clinton ruthlessly during the campaign, at times saying he would throw her in jail, he carried on the American tradition of congratulating her and calling for unity.
To all Republicans and Democrats and independents across this nation, I say it is time for us to come together as one united people.
Then, on the following morning,
Last night, I congratulated Donald Trump and offered to work with him on behalf of our country. I hope that he will be a successful president for all Americans.
Hillary Clinton also followed the American tradition and conceded while calling for unity.
And I still believe, as deeply as I ever have, that if we stand together and work together with respect for our differences, strength in our convictions, and love for this nation, our best days are still ahead of us.
But it wasn't long before yet again a movement started.
Not my president! Not my president!
The massive crowd of several thousand gathered on the Common before shutting down streets. Anger and frustration over the president-elect drew them together.
This time, claiming that Donald Trump was not a legitimate president.
In cities across the country, thousands took to the streets to voice outrage over the election of Donald Trump. On the West Coast, protesters set fires and faced off with police. In Los Angeles, hundreds ran onto Interstate 101, temporarily shutting it down.
Trump has tapped into something very deep and dark and evil in our country, and now we're all going to pay.
Thousands of people gathered all around the country. Some of them burned Trump's likeness and effigy. Others blocked roads and buildings.
About 65 people were arrested near Trump Tower, most for disorderly conduct.
And eventually, this idea that Donald Trump was not a legitimate president grew into a more mainstream view, with some taking it as far as to claim that the election had been stolen. All right, Megan, so let's talk about the ways that these claims of stolen elections or illegitimacy differed from the claims that were being made back in the 1960s.
There are two ways to think about an election being fraudulent, right? And one is that literally someone took the vote tallies and changed them, or they
hacked a machine.
Yeah. Right? Stuffed a ballot box. There's another way of thinking about whether an election is fraudulent, and that is things like Jim Crow is the easiest example, right? If you have rules that basically exclude African Americans from voting, is that a legitimate election result? I mean, nominally you have all the forms, but you're keeping a large percentage of your electorate from voting.
Voter suppression is another way of manipulating the voter outcome.
Yes, exactly. But what's interesting is where people start very quickly fixating, in Hillary Clinton's case, is the sense that the media had cost her the election.
Is the media complicitness? Of course they are.
Trump had so much free media that he was everywhere, right? And he didn't even really need to
spend money because he got so much free media.
Trump got, $1.8 billion worth of free media.
Trump got about $2 billion of free media coverage.
Got nearly $3.2 billion of free advertising and free media coverage in 2016.
The media and Russia hacks and James Comey had cost her the election.
It was really the weaponization of information.
They're determined that Russia was interfering in the election specifically to try to hand the presidency to Donald Trump.
And I think the American people deserve an investigation into how a foreign government had an impact on our election.
The outside intervention, the combination of the Comey letter on October 28th, WikiLeaks, which played a much bigger role than I think many people understand yet, had the determinative effect.
What had happened was a failure of institutions to suppress Trump and boost Clinton. That was like an illegitimate thing that had happened. And of course, then there was also the Electoral College. She had won the popular vote, and she didn't get the presidency, and that had happened before in recent history, right? Bush had also, in 2000, lost the popular vote, but still won. And the sense that the system was rigged against Clinton. And that was why it was illegitimate.
All right, so the argument goes that the combination of Russia and the media and Comey at the FBI and the Electoral College, all of that is what led to Clinton losing and Trump winning. And therefore, that's just an illegitimate way to win.
Exactly.
I don't see this president-elect as a legitimate president.
And this was a view that was voiced openly by many, including powerful Democrats like Senator John Lewis.
I think there was a conspiracy on the part of the Russians and others to help him get elected. That's not right. That's not fair.
Former President Jimmy Carter.
Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered.
Current Vice President and nominee Kamala Harris.
Because I think he's an illegitimate president that didn't really win.
You are absolutely right.
And eventually, in striking contrast to her concession speech, by 2019, Hillary Clinton had completely changed her attitude about her election loss.
You can run the best campaign, you can even become the nominee, and you can have the election stolen from you.
The other thing I would say is that underneath all of that was a sense that, well, his voters are all racists, and that's why they like him. And, racists shouldn't get to pick the president of the United States.
He's a racist, homophobic, xenophobic nightmare, misogynist nightmare, and he doesn't represent the values that I know to be American values.
No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA.
And so there was all of those things tied up, but none of them were about voting machines. These things were about, the system itself.
Right, this is a very different reaction than even in 2000 when things got so contentious. Yeah. And part of that is because the fight in 2000 is so physical in some ways. Look at this butterfly ballot. This is suddenly making a move into something more abstract, right? The participation of institutions in allowing a thing to happen that is against the spirit of our country.
The actual details of the argument, I think, were less important than the sense that someone like Donald Trump just can never be legitimately the president of the United States.
I believe he knows he's an illegitimate president. He knows. I know that he knows that this wasn't on the level.
We'll be right back.
It's like my father says, no matter what you do in this world, you're going to pay a price.
I'm Mark Smerling, filmmaker and podcaster. But for the past year, I felt like a priest, taking dizzying confessions from a brutal mafia enforcer.
I was the guy that they were bringing up in the family to be a gangster.
His name is Anthony Ramundi. And as he's looking back over his life, there's one sin he thinks might get him turned away at the pearly gates.
When I die, I'm going to go to heaven. God's going to say, nah, fuck you. You killed one of my popes.
A
shocking update here from the Vatican. Pope John Paul I has died.
But could Anthony's stories be too biblical to be gospel?
Anthony doesn't look familiar to me at all.
So he's a fabulist. You know, some of it's true, some of it's fabulous. There's fabulous, and then there's... It goes beyond fabulous.
The Confessions of Anthony Raimondi, a new series from USG Audio and Truth Media. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
And I'm saying to myself, how did I get into this mess? This is the guy who, like, supposedly directly talks to God.
Georgia, Georgia.
Chapter 5, Georgia on My Mind.
Okay, so I want to take a detour now from our walk through these different presidential elections to focus on a race for governor. In 2018, so that would have been the next election cycle after Trump's big surprise win, can you walk me through what happened in Georgia and how Stacey Abrams makes it into the election denial history books, so to speak?
So Stacey Abrams was running for governor of Georgia. She lost to Brian Kemp, who is the current governor of Georgia.
This year, more than 200 years into Georgia's democratic experiment, the state failed its voters.
And she refused to concede.
Let's be clear. This is not a speech of concession.
Abrams at various times has said the election was stolen.
And so in response to what I believe was a stolen election,
she suggested that the election laws were rigged and that it was not a free or fair election.
Was the election in Georgia statewide a free and fair election?
It was not a free and fair election. Citizens tried to exercise their constitutional rights and were still denied the ability to elect their leaders.
She claimed that voter suppression was to blame for her loss.
I didn't lose. I got the votes, but we won't know exactly how many because of how they cheated.
Do you think that there was deliberate interference in the election?
Yes.
Now, she didn't attempt to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power. And while she did acknowledge that Kemp was the governor, she refused to say that he was the legitimate governor.
I acknowledge that former Secretary of State Brian Kemp will be certified as the victor in the 2018 gubernatorial election. But to watch an elected official who claims to represent the people in this state baldly pin his hopes for election on the suppression of the people's democratic right to vote has been truly appalling.
Right, so she was playing this kind of verbal game, which was, in a fair system, I would have won this election. But because they've done all of these illegitimate things, this election isn't really legitimate, but I lost the illegitimate election by the rules under which it was conducted.
Is he the legitimate governor-elect of Georgia?
He is the person who won an adequate number of votes
but that's
to become the governor of
with all due respect, and I respect where you're coming from, and I respect the issues that you're raising. You're not answering the question. Do you think it was? You're not using the word legitimate. Is he the legitimate governor-elect of Georgia?
He is the legal governor of Georgia. And here's the thing, Jake, I want to be very clear.
Several weeks after the election, Abrams and some of her campaign started an organization called Fair Fight, and they sued the state of Georgia.
Stacey Abrams now has opted to file another lawsuit. The federal suit filed by the Fair Fight Action alleges gross mismanagement of the November 6th election. Joe Hankey talked with the plaintiffs today.
And they listed a number of ways that they claimed the state was unconstitutionally suppressing the rights of voters, including unlawfully purging voters off of voter rolls, closing polling stations, mishandling absentee ballots, and maybe most notably of all, claims that her opponent Brian Kemp, who was at the time the acting Secretary of State overseeing the election that he was competing in, used that position to manipulate the outcome.
The person I ran against was the Secretary of State. He was the referee, the contestant, and the scorekeeper.
The legal battles were in court for almost 4 years before finally,
Fair Fight Action was handed a loss in federal court. It called for a broad overhaul of Georgia's election system.
The courts ruled against Abrams and her organization.
The judge has now ruled against Stacey Abrams. The judge stated that although Georgia's election system is not perfect, the challenge practices did not violate the Constitution.
The court's ruling did acknowledge some issues with Georgia's election system, but found no widespread voter suppression or intentional misconduct by the Secretary of State's office. The judge determined that the way that voter registration rolls and absentee ballots were handled did not violate the Constitution or the Voting Rights Act. Although Fair Fight had presented testimony from voters who experienced difficulties in voting, including standing in long lines, the court found that most were ultimately able to vote. And in the end, there was no compelling evidence of an effort to suppress votes and steal an election.
And so it just doesn't look like there's any evidence that she could have won this election under different rules, with more polling places, any of the rest of it. It just looks like she lost the election.
However, Stacey Abrams continued to make these claims about her election.
What we know is that in the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp and Brad Rassenberger are hard at work denying access to the right to vote.
Despite the final tally and the inauguration and the situation we find ourselves in, I do have one very affirmative statement to make. We won.
And as she did, she grew into a national public figure, winning the support of several top Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris.
Let's say this loud and clear. Without voter suppression, Stacey Abrams would be the governor of Georgia.
Has she ever conceded defeat? Has she ever changed her mind on that?
As far as I know, Stacey Abrams has never admitted that she lost the election.
Stacey Abrams became the first American politician in over 100 years to refuse to concede her loss in a major U.S. election. But that was a title that she would not hold for long.
Right here? Mr. President, real quickly, win, lose, or draw in this election, will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
That's it for part 2. Join us in part 3, where we'll dive into the strange irony that while our elections have only gotten more and more secure in recent years, the claims of stolen elections have only grown louder. If you'd like early access to that episode, you can become a subscriber by following the link in the show notes or visiting us at reflector.show. For just a few bucks a month, you can ensure that we can keep doing this work and telling these stories. This episode was produced by Andy Mills and me, Matt Bohl. Special thanks to Megan McCardle and Megan Phelps-Roper. We always love hearing from you. You can email us at hello@reflector.show or leave a comment on our website. We'll see you soon.